My name is Ruben, and this story isn't mine, but my father, Luis Felipe's. He rarely told it, and when he did, he lowered his voice as if it were a secret, giving it an air of mystery that always terrified me when I was little. Now, with his permission, I want to share his story with you. It happened about 40 years ago on a mountain road that crosses the Andes. It wasn't a wide or safe road. The lanes were narrow. There were many blind curves, one after another, with a rock face on the right and empty space on the left, with no guardrails in several sections. One mistake behind the wheel, and your truck would fall some 30 or 40 meters before crashing to the mountainside. Furthermore, anyone born after 2000 should remember that back then, there were no cell phones or rapid rescue services. If you had a mishap on the highway, if you fell into a ravine, no one would rescue you. No one would even notice until much later. This was something that truckers who had to cross those roads were very aware of, including my dad, who knew the route well. This didn't make him overconfident, rather it motivated him to be even more careful. My father drove a simple truck, large enough to carry a significant load, but compact enough to navigate that narrow road. As my father remembers, it was a dark afternoon with thick fog. He regretted not having stopped at the previous rest stop, but it was impossible to predict that the fog would descend so suddenly. That's why he drove slowly, staying in second gear for almost the entire journey and taking each curve very carefully. All the while, he listened to the trucker's radio, hoping for updates on road conditions, since in a place like this, without phones, the radio was the only way for truckers to keep an eye on each other in case something happened. However, the radio remained silent for about an hour until it crackled to life with a woman's voice. Her transmission was broken, her words clipped with fear. "Hello? Hello? Can anyone hear me? I think I've gone off the road. My truck is on the edge." My father immediately picked up the microphone. He identified himself, gave his position, and asked for hers. The woman's voice trembled. She explained that she'd taken a curve too wide. Her front wheels were over the edge. The truck was balanced, but she was terrified to move. Unfortunately, it wasn't the first time my dad had heard of a similar situation. On those Andean roads, taking a curve too wide can mean the tires lose contact with the asphalt. And if the truck is suspended in equilibrium, even a breath of air can cause it to plummet. My father, apparently the only trucker on that part of the route at that hour, told her to calm down and that he would try to help her, to which she assured him that she had her hazard lights on, and she roughly told him which section she was in. My father immediately replied that she was close, that she should hang on, that he was coming for her. He asked her not to move, to keep the brake on, and to pray a lot if she happened to be religious. He continued down the road. In that area, according to my father, the asphalt disappeared intermittently, and the road practically became a combination of loose dirt and gravel. The woman's voice began to break up with static. She spoke in bursts with frequency clicks. "I'm still here. The truck is moving. I don't want to fall off. Are you almost there?" My father answered and looked around for her, but the fog was getting worse. He could barely see the tip of the hood, part of the road, and the stone wall on the right side. Finally, he reached the section she had described, a horseshoe bend that opens onto a natural viewpoint, notorious for the accidents it caused. My dad was in first gear, so slow that a running child could have easily overtaken him, scanning the horizon for any red flash. But nothing, not even a reflection. He tried to contact her again by radio, but it was impossible, and he had to drive a couple more minutes until, a few meters ahead, he saw a very faint red glow, as if the turn signals were obscured by fog. My father pulled as close as he could to the mountainside and turned on his own turn signals while radioing the woman. "I see you. Don't move. I'm almost there." But the radio returned only distortion, a static-like chittering, but nothing could be heard. My father got out and walked, waving his flashlight, calling loudly, hoping to hear the woman's shouts in response. But again, there was only silence and the deep mountain chill. He waited a minute, then two, nothing. He returned to his truck and slowly advanced along that stretch. He flashed his high beams, his low beams, honked twice, only silence broken by the sound of his own engine and the fog passing like smoke. He radioed again, but no one answered. My father thought that perhaps the woman had been rescued by another driver or had managed to get her truck back on the road. But something in his gut told him that wasn't it. As he was about to leave, a gust of wind parted the fog for just an instant. On the side of the road, tucked against the rock face, he saw a small white chapel, one of those roadside memorials for people who died in accidents. He hadn't noticed it before. He stopped the truck again and walked over to it. Inside the glass box was a photograph of a woman in a work uniform, and her name was Carmen Judith, an exemplary mother and friend. The date of death was many years ago, and beneath the photo and plaque were some worn-out votive candles. The plaque didn't say where or how she died, but since these chapels are always placed near the spot where the person passed away, my dad knew immediately it must be around there. He stood there for a while looking at it, and then instinctively he went over to the edge, not far, but close enough to look down. The fog lifted slightly, and he caught a glimpse among the rocks and bushes of the rusted remains of a truck. No tires, no cab, long since looted, its color almost faded. It looked like it had been there for years, and he immediately understood what had happened. He returned to the truck, a chill running down his spine that wasn't from the weather. He climbed in, locked the door, and took a deep breath. He tried the radio, but there was only static on the other end, since he was probably the only trucker on the road. He called again, just in case, but a profound silence on the other end told him it was time to leave. He sat motionless for a minute, his hands on the steering wheel, praying for the soul of Carmen Judith, a woman who hasn't forgotten. Then he shifted into first gear and continued on his way. That night he didn't speak to anyone until he left the mountain pass. When he reached the village on the other side, he asked a mechanic at the truck yard about the chapel. The man nodded without surprise. Yes, the woman in the truck. It disappeared down the ravine many years ago. Some people think they see its lights when it's foggy, but I've never seen them. My father didn't say anything else. He simply bought a candle, and on his next trip he placed it in the chapel, a small offering to a colleague who lost her life on a dangerous curve. However, my father retired for a while, and when he came back along that road, a landslide had taken the chapel away. Years later I was born, and when he taught me to drive in the mountains, he repeated 3 rules. Keep the radio on, take the curves slowly, and never panic if you see strange things in the dark or fog, because sometimes you see strange things on the road, some innocent and others malevolent. Now I'm a trucker like my father was, and every time I cross a foggy pass and the radio crackles, I remember that story and wonder if I'll ever experience something similar. I hope not. Thanks to my father, I've also adopted another tradition. When I see a chapel on the side of the road, I slow down. Not out of respect for the law, but out of respect for those who have not returned and for the voices that still cry out for help from elsewhere. I say in Our Father and continue on my way. My name is Orlando, and I've been a truck driver for many years, although I'm about to retire. While reminiscing about my anecdotes and experiences, I realized that this story is perfect to share. I hope you can hear it. Everything I'm about to tell you happened to me in November of 1995 when I was crossing merchandise from Venezuela to Colombia through the plains. I was younger and drove fast, steadily, and always made deliveries on time. I didn't do it for pleasure, but because back then, if you went too slowly or stopped, you were easy prey for highway robbers and other bad people who wanted to harm you and steal your merchandise. It was night, the road was already dark, and I was driving along a straight stretch of asphalt that extended for kilometers. There were no streetlights on that road, and I knew it. So I had my high beams on so I could see several meters ahead of my truck and have time to react in case someone put an obstacle in the road to stop me or something like that. It wasn't my first time driving that route, so I'm sure there weren't any utility poles or houses along the way. That's why I was so surprised to see someone standing in the distance, right in the middle of the road between the 2 lanes. My chest tightened as I thought it was an ambush. I had to accelerate or brake. Those were my only 2 options. But the person didn't walk or run. He just darted out without thinking. I let out a loud yell as I slammed on the brakes and heard the sound of a body hitting the bumper of my truck. The tires squealed, and the back of the truck swayed so much I thought I'd lose control and roll over. The thought of a police ticket flashed through my mind if they saw me, the price of the repair shop for having wrecked my brakes. I even thought I was dead, or that I'd be arrested for murder. The large semi-truck stopped. A miracle or good luck? I didn't roll over. I turned off the transmission, left the hazard lights on, grabbed my flashlight, and ran out of the truck to see what condition the person I'd hit was in. Well, if I really had hit him, he must have been more than dead by now, but it was my duty. The first thing I checked was the grill and the bumper, and from there I noticed that something strange must be going on, since there wasn't even the slightest mark that I had hit anyone. Then I checked under the chassis, the sides, and the wheels, but there was absolutely nothing. No clothing, no blood, not a single dent out of place. I went back to shine my light on the container door, the asphalt, and the side of the road, but I found absolutely nothing. I even waved loudly, calling out to whoever had jumped onto my truck as if there were the slightest chance of survival after that impact. But nothing. Only silence. Not even the wind could be heard. Suddenly, a bird from the plains sang. It wasn't a pretty song. I can only describe it as a shriek that took my breath away. Luckily, I'm from the plains and I know that bird. It was a rufous-collared sparrow. The truth is, I calmed down, put away my flashlight, and climbed back into my truck. I shifted into first gear and drove off without looking back, thinking that somehow my imagination had played a trick on me. If this were the end of it, it would be the perfect anecdote to tell over coffee. But no, a while passed, and I was back on the road at a good speed. A few kilometers later, I noticed something in the side mirror. At first, it was a white fabric-like glint. I adjusted the mirror with a quick flick of my wrist, thinking it was a loose piece of plastic. And then I saw it clearly. A woman stood on the bumper of my trailer, clinging to I don't know what, stiff as a statue. The wind didn't move her hair. I realized I wasn't seeing something normal. I braced my hands and stared straight ahead. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw she was still there. She wasn't signaling or making a sound. She wasn't doing anything, except standing there staring straight ahead. I sped through a checkpoint. It was impossible that anything else could possibly happen to me in broad daylight. My palms were sweating, and I really needed to pee. I stopped at a small gas station before entering the city of my destination. When I finished, I checked the back, and everything was in order. The license plate was in place, and the rear bumper showed no sign of anyone having been standing on it for hours. I stood there for a while, hands on my hips, staring at the container as if it were about to answer me what had happened. I handed over the merchandise, signed, and got paid. And when I got back to the cab, I felt like I'd breathed a sigh of relief. I thought it had been the shock, the exhaustion, whatever you want to believe. But it wasn't long before I was assigned another route, and on that second trip, at midnight, I saw it again in the rearview mirror. I didn't see it every night, but it appeared from time to time, always behind me, as if it would never fall off, as if it were standing on the asphalt and not on the bumper of a truck bouncing along the road. That went on until I sold the trailer for that to happen. My name is Hector, and this happened to me a few years ago. I've been a truck driver for a few years now, and I work with a company that gets me jobs and sends me to different parts of the country. On this occasion, they sent me to pick up a load at a depot in Sinaloa and take it to some warehouses in Mexico City. The pay was good, and I knew the route, so I accepted without asking questions. I should have. I arrived at the depot a little after 7 at night. It was a large, dimly lit yard, and they directed me to a loading bay where 5 wooden boxes were waiting. They were about the size of a large refrigerator. What was strange was the weight. 2 assistants were moving them like they were made of cardboard, as if they were empty. Even the trailer's suspension didn't sag when they loaded them, which I found very odd. And something I did notice was that they secured them quite well so they wouldn't move inside the trailer. I asked the supervisor what was inside those boxes, and although for a moment he seemed like he wanted to tell me something, in the end he just shrugged before saying, "Small but delicate material. Handle with care." Another worker nearby seemed nervous and shook himself violently after getting out of the trailer. Everything was strange, but I didn't press the issue. It wasn't my job to open anything or check the cargo, just to move it from one place to another. That's why I signed the paperwork and they gave me the receipt. By 8:30, I was already on my way out. I hit the highway heading south. I stopped before 10 at a gas station to get coffee and a couple of sandwiches. Anyway, I got back on the road, and after a few kilometers, I heard a muffled knocking. At first, I thought it was something loose bouncing around in the cab, but I checked around and glanced in my sleeper berth and didn't see anything moving when I heard those muffled knocks again. This time, I noticed they had a rhythm, like someone was tapping their knuckles on a wooden door. I turned down the music on the app and strained my ears. When they sounded for the third time, I could make out that the banging was coming from inside the trailer, from between the boxes. It clearly wasn't a loud sound, since there were several meters between the trailer and my truck's cab, and even centimeters of noise can make difference. My stomach clenched, and this time I really had to ease off the accelerator. I tried to convince myself to back off, but in the end, my conscience compelled me, and at the next rest stop, I pulled over to check. However, as soon as I got out of the truck, a terrible fear gripped me, because if what was happening in the back was a problem with the heavy equipment, if you know what I mean, leaking out might be the last thing I ever did. Nevertheless, I dared and opened the back door. The wailing stopped abruptly, and in the darkness, I could see 5 sealed and tied up boxes. Nothing to see, nothing to hear. I returned to my seat and continued on my way. For the next hour, I heard nothing, but it was as if something had been waiting for me to calm down. Suddenly, the whimpering and banging were replaced by a soft scratching, fingernails scraping wood. It was a slow noise, different from what someone trying to find a way out would make. My hands sweated on the steering wheel, and I nervously checked the rearview mirror, as if that would help. I saw nothing but the red wall of the trailer behind me. Thoughts of calling the feds crossed my mind, but I also thought about the sender, the information I'd left in the depot logbook. Who might read it, and who might be upset that I'd ruined one of their dirty deals? My conscience pulled me in one direction, my survival instinct in the other, and meanwhile, scratches and whining noises reached me through the wall of my cabin. This went on for several kilometers. I kept telling myself it was just the sounds of loading cargo, that the vibration of the trailer was making the wood creak, and that some loose nut was producing a squeak that I was mistaking for whining. Pure lies to calm myself down, obviously. The next leg was long and dark. I spent hours with my eye on the rearview mirror and my ear straining at any new sound. The noises from the back came and went without any sense, and then suddenly something changed without me doing anything. The noises shifted, and the excuse that it was something from the woodwork or a nut vanished when I began to feel a soft rustling coming from the cabin, as if someone had sat down right behind me. I didn't hear footsteps or knocks, nothing, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling of a presence sitting behind me. A ragged breath, a muffled cry, barely perceptible amidst the music and the noise of my engine, but clear enough for me to know I wasn't imagining it. The air turned cold, not so cold I could see my breath, but still cold, though I didn't do anything about it, since at that point I seriously doubted it was a human trafficking case. At one of the checkpoints, the guard asked for my papers and gave the inside of my cab a routine look. He said, "Everything's fine." He returned my documents and let me go. I thought, if there were someone there, they would have noticed. They would have noticed the whistling noises, something. But no. And besides, the cold still lingered in the cabin, and the feeling of being alone, too. The faint noises behind me started up again, and as I moved further away from the checkpoints, all I could do was pretend nothing was wrong. I arrived several hours later in Mexico City, at the warehouses they had told me about. Large yard, bright lights, cameras everywhere. I honked the horn. A guy came out with a folder in his hand. He saw the shipping number, signed without saying much, and called 2 men over to unload. He paid in cash with folded bills inside an envelope and said to me, "Thank you for being punctual," without looking me in the eye. The 2 who unloaded the boxes from the truck were skinny, dressed in black with gloves. They pushed each box as if it weighed nothing. They rolled them down the ramp effortlessly, with a lightness that made it clear there was no human inside. It wasn't even the weight of solid wood. It was practically air. I watched them take away the 5 boxes in less than 10 minutes. What on earth was inside those boxes? I have no idea. I stood by the cab with my hands in my pockets, watching them disappear through a large door. No one made jokes, asked me how the trip was, or even offered me a glass of water. I never went back to those depots, so I don't know if they're always that cold or if that delivery was so important that there wasn't time to waste. Everything was quick and quiet. When they finished, the attendant signaled to me that it was ready. I nodded, but before getting in, I peeked into the empty truck bed. There was nothing there, not even a peculiar smell lingered, just rusty metal and a profound silence that didn't match the cacophony of sounds that had accompanied me throughout the trip. I closed the door, climbed in, and started my truck. The cold of the sleeper cab was gone, and so was the feeling of being alone. The seat behind me was in its place, just as it had been. I checked the dark rearview mirror. It was normal. Everything calmed down the instant they unloaded those boxes from my truck. I left the yard, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I stopped a few blocks later to catch my breath. I thought about reporting it, but what could I say about boxes that weighed next to nothing making noises like some kind of impromptu spiritual cleansing? I don't know anything about that, but oh well, the internet helped. I found fine marks on the seat back, shallow lines like fingernail marks, not very long or very deep, but something had definitely scratched the back of my seat. There might be another explanation besides the paranormal. I don't know, but I do know that seeing them made me feel a little better, knowing I hadn't completely gone crazy. Then I started my truck, contacted the company that gave me the jobs, and took another route to keep working. After all, I have to keep working, and that strange event couldn't stop me. Since then, whenever I'm offered a job, I ask, "What's the cargo?" and let my instincts guide me in deciding whether or not to accept certain jobs. When the load is very light, I refuse, or at least think twice about it. I'd rather haul steel, glass, anything heavy than carry empty boxes and weeping ghosts the whole way. It was one of the worst jobs I've ever had. I'm a trucker, and years ago, before GPS and smartphones, I was heading north on a highway in the early hours of the morning. The road was completely deserted, no traffic, not even a lit house on the horizon. I was driving calmly, listening to the radio, when I saw a man on the shoulder waving for a ride. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have stopped, but something about his figure made me hesitate. He didn't look threatening. He looked like a middle-aged man who was simply stranded. I slowed down and stopped a few meters ahead. He approached the passenger side window and, without saying a word, pointed to the door. I opened it, and he got in. He thanked me with a simple, "Thank you," and fastened his seatbelt. His cold demeanor made me a little uncomfortable, and it wasn't like I was expecting him to cry while thanking me for rescuing him from the middle of nowhere. But I don't know, there was something odd about his coldness. I started the car. I tried to make conversation a couple of times as we drove along that dark road. I commented on how cold the night was, how strange the weather was, how the asphalt on that stretch was in terrible condition, and all sorts of everyday things. The man didn't respond at all, not even a "you're right" or an "uh-huh." He just nodded. I offered him a cigarette and left it there between the two seats. He didn't say anything about whether he smoked or not, he just nodded, but he didn't even touch it. I thought about insisting, but at that point it didn't matter anymore. When a passenger doesn't want to talk, they don't want to talk. I turned down the air conditioning a bit because I suddenly felt the cabin was colder than before. It wasn't anything extreme, but I noticed it. I kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The speedometer read 100 kilometers per h. The radio was on low, just so the silence wouldn't bother me so much, and every time I glanced over, the man was still there, rigid as if he were a statue or some kind of mannequin. I got a good look at him. He was an ordinary man, dressed in a long-sleeved shirt, jeans, and dress shoes. He had brown hair combed back, and he seemed to wear glasses because he had a pair tucked away in his shirt pocket. For a moment I thought maybe he was dozing with his eyes open. I don't know, I was just looking for an excuse to explain his peculiar behavior, but in the end I gave up, and my attention went completely to the road, almost forgetting that I had company. An hour easily passed, during which I forgot my companion existed. I didn't bother to turn around to look at him or check if he was okay, since his indifference had irritated me. However, when we reached a sign, I remembered he was there and told him that we were approaching a small town and that if he wanted, I could drop him off at the entrance, where there was electricity, a gas station, and I think even a motel. I didn't get a response. That's when I turned around to look at him head on. There was no one there. The seat was empty, but the seatbelt was still fastened, a silent witness that someone had gotten into the truck an hour earlier and buckled it up. Yet there it was, the seat completely empty. I didn't hear the door open, and I didn't have a sleeper berth in that truck, so there was no way he could have hidden anywhere in the cab. Besides, I was traveling at 100 kilometers per h, and at that speed, no one would jump out of a truck. A faint smell. How to explain it? It was like a combination of the typical smell of a refrigerator and damp earth. That surprised me because that area is arid and rocky. It hadn't rained in days. Even so, the smell of damp earth was there, as if someone had gotten in with soaking wet boots and then taken them off. I touched the rubber mat on the passenger seat with my fingers, and it was dry. I checked the seatbelt again, and it was still fastened. I unfastened it, and the buckle clicked normally, as if nothing had ever happened. And at that moment, I wondered if I had imagined it all, but in that case, how did he fasten his seatbelt? I had no answers to my questions, and it was getting late. I started the car carefully. I didn't want to be stuck on a stretch of road with nothing around. I put on some music, hoping to distract myself a bit, but I turned it down right away because it was bothering me. In the end, I was left with only the sound of the engine and the rolling tires, wondering what on earth had happened. For the next few minutes, the smell of wet earth lingered. It wasn't a strong smell, but it didn't go away. From then on, nothing unusual happened in a physical sense. I didn't feel any brushes, I didn't see any strange lights, I didn't hear any voices or whispers, and obviously I didn't see anything out of the corner of my eye or on the road. The only strange thing was the constant feeling of being accompanied, like when you know someone is watching you, even though you can't see them. I took a deep breath and tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I didn't want to speak out loud, since by that point I had convinced myself I was going crazy. I decided to make a stop. I turned off the highway at the next exit and went to a 24-hour convenience store. I parked the truck and turned off the engine and went to the bathroom. I bought something to drink and even stayed a few minutes chatting with the guy at the OXXO. Then I stretched my legs for about 20 minutes with a coffee in my hand, constantly glancing at my truck. Nothing happened, and I didn't see anything either. But by the time I returned, the smell of wet earth was gone. Before resuming my journey, I opened the passenger door and looked at the seat. Nothing. Loose seatbelt, carpet, and dry seats. I told myself that exhaustion was catching up with me, that so many sleepless nights had made me imagine it all. And yet, a part of me told me that it had obviously all been real. I realized that even in my state, there are things you can't imagine. Someone got into my truck and buckled their seatbelt. I couldn't deny that. Anyway, that night I did try to sleep, but at the next stop, a few kilometers further north, I lay back in the driver's seat and adjusted the backrest to lie down. I fell asleep immediately. Keep one thing in mind, and that is that I don't dream much. Or at least, I don't remember my dreams. But that night I had a brief but very vivid nightmare. I dreamed of a man sitting next to me, rigid and silent. And in the dream, I asked him where he wanted to get off, and he, without moving his mouth, said, "Where the earth is wet." Then I woke up with a start. It was almost dawn, and the sunlight made the remaining kilometers much more bearable. I arrived at my destination, unloaded, signed the usual paperwork, and relaxed. In the client's yard, the air smelled of dust and gasoline. There was no humidity at all. But as soon as I climbed in to move the truck to another bay, I caught a faint scent of damp earth. When I glanced at the passenger seat, I realized the seatbelt was fastened. I hadn't fastened it. I stood still with my hand on the buckle and unfastened it. Nothing. The smell didn't return. The sensation didn't return. I slept well for the first time in several days, and after 2 days, I was back home, safe and sound. I told this story to my wife and some trusted friends, and they, being a bit more skeptical, began to offer logical explanations for what I experienced. Now, I don't know if someone got in and out of my vehicle without making a sound, and then sleep and autosuggestion did the rest, or if something decided that I was the one who had to take it north. But the truth is, something happened to me that night. I can say that because of the multiple pieces of evidence it left me with. The smell of earth, the approach of sleep, and that belt fastened more than once without my touching it. And if you ask me if I would ever pick someone up again in the early hours, I say no. That was more than enough.